Hello and welcome back, goats, to the BigBluePurple channel, and to my worst to best ranking of the dungeons in 14's Dawntrail expansion. I'll be ranking these on numerous factors such as their boss design, their ad packs, their music, and the overall aesthetic of the dungeons in general. Do keep in mind that I am mostly a melee DPS and a tank player, so I'll be ranking these dungeons as such. That being said, I will still try to consider factors that would affect healers, for example. And also, if you happen to be watching this video in the future when 7.1 or 7.2 is already out, this only includes the dungeons released with Dawntrail and not the ones in the patches. Those will likely get their own separate video if their quality continues to live up to these dungeons. I also just want to say before we get into the ranking itself, all of these dungeons stand out a ton within the context of Final Fantasy XIV. Like, these are the best dungeons we've ever seen in terms of quality, so if your favorite of the bunch happens to be a bit lower on the list, it's not at all because I dislike it, it's mostly just because I like the other ones more. Anyways, with all that said, grab yourself a snack, grab yourself a drink, because it's probably going to be a long one, and let's get straight into the ranking with our bottom spot. Coming in at our number 8 spot, we have Katumu. Hopefully I'm saying that right. This is the first dungeon from the Dawntrail expansion, and honestly, I think this is the only one that lacks the same level of quality as the other 7. To me, this kind of feels like an extension of Endwalker dungeon design, rather than a step forward into Dawntrail dungeon design, if you kind of get what I'm saying. It starts off by doing something I'm kind of never really a fan of in these dungeons, and that's having you on a stationary platform where you're going towards a destination, right? In this case, you're on a boat trying to get somewhere, and ads just show up and attack you, and then you wait, and then more ads show up and attack you, and you repeat until you actually make it to the first boss. They did this in Endwalker with Lapis Manalis, they did it in Shadowbringers with the one where you ride Bismarck. They've done it a few times, and every time, it's kind of a cool spectacle at first, but upon repeating the dungeon, it's just not terribly interesting, and not being able to actually move around a map creates for a less interesting experience, in my opinion. Thankfully, this segment is only the beginning part of the dungeon before the first boss. It doesn't drag on for too long, and the rest of the dungeon is quite a step up from this. Our first boss is this big seal-looking fellow, the Prime Punity. Overall, a very kind of chill and straightforward first boss. I think their intention with this dungeon was kind of to have something to ease returning players back into the game who had taken a long break after Endwalker and whatnot. And this dungeon is pretty good at doing that because it doesn't really throw any mechanics at you that you have no idea how to resolve or you've never seen before. The main standout mechanic in this fight is kind of this AoE vomit attack where he just spams a fuck ton of AoEs everywhere, and there's a very small safe spot that you need to find, which I think is pretty cool, and then you have to move into this donut afterwards, which could end up spawning pretty much anywhere, to my knowledge. So overall, it's kind of a fun dodge. I like how there's not a lot of openings or safe spots for you to go to, but you also have plenty of time to find said safe spots and dodge the mechanic, because it is the first dungeon. It is just a regular normal mode dungeon. Still a pretty cool mechanic though. Overall though, an extremely simple boss fight. There's this kind of spread mechanic that happens where you spawn an ad and then you need to AoE him down. Really not a huge deal, nothing we haven't really seen before. Overall, very simple first boss. Not much to say about it. Heading towards the second boss, they actually have these ladders that you climb. I think this is kind of a new thing to 14. I don't recall there being very many ladders in this game, if at all. So, hey, good on them for adding something brand new in this dungeon, right? There's also these Mimiclot enemies that'll mimic what your party members look like and what you look like, and it's pretty funny to see a giant version of yourself attacking you and shit, so I thought that's a little fun ad idea, even if they don't really do a whole lot outside of being ads to AoE down. Skipping over to the second boss, again, not a whole lot to talk about here. Yeah, very simple mechanics. He spawns these vines from the floor that'll point in certain directions and do a big cleave, and then he'll actually grow them, so you need to find a different safe spot, because some of them will spin around and shit. And then you need to find a safe spot to account for how big the AoEs get, so, that's kind of cool. Nothing crazy, that's kind of the main mechanic of this fight. Once again, a dungeon that's clearly designed to ease people back into the game and not throw anything super jarring at them. Skipping over to our final set of ads and final boss, I just want to say this last part of the dungeon looks absolutely beautiful. This is one of the first times in Dawntrail where I was really able to notice the graphics update. Holy shit, the game could not look this good in Endwalker, so big props to them on that. I also appreciate this little characterization here of the boss where you see him feasting on like the corpses of dead animals over here, and that's going to end up being a mechanic actually in his boss fight. So I thought that was a really cool way to give him some sort of characterization before you actually go ahead and fight him. Again, a very straightforward boss following the same pattern as the previous two, but this one has some pretty fun mechanics. There's this little line mechanic here where I ate shit on because I was trying to be the greed god and I wasn't. And I do appreciate mechanics, especially in normal modes, where they let you try to be the greed god because it's more fun, you know? There's not a lot of stakes in these normal modes, so I do appreciate getting to like try to greed uptime on these bosses as a melee DPS. That's one of my favorite things to do. He also puts these like lightning rings on the arena that'll shoot these cones out of them in 4 directions, and then you basically have to dodge into the safe pizza slice. I thought this is a cool little mechanic. Again, nothing too complicated, but it can be a little bit harder to read than your typical like AoE like that because there's 2 of them stacking on top of each other. So not a bad mechanic at all and pretty cool. I think the main standout of this boss is how he'll spawn different enemies onto the arena and then he'll devour them, gain their ability, and then do a different mechanic with that. So I think that's pretty damn cool, and it makes the boss stand out more so than anything else in the dungeon, in my opinion. So all in all, a super solid dungeon. It's just the weaker of the bunch because it doesn't really push the bar in any meaningful way compared to all of the other dungeons this expansion. Coming in at the number 7 spot, we have the level 89 dungeon, Origenics. Now, this is where the ranking starts to get a lot closer for me. I feel like the level 91 dungeon is far and away the weakest of the 8 that we got, whereas from now onwards, this is getting to a point where we're comparing very, very close dungeons in quality. I think Origenics is a fantastic dungeon. I think it's only brought down by the fact that it's quite samey to the dungeon that came directly before it, being Vanguard, which we'll talk about in a bit. I also feel like in comparison to something like Vanguard, the average ad pulls and the bosses here are just not quite as exciting as that dungeon to me. That being said, I do absolutely love the aesthetic of this dungeon. I love that purple glow that everything has to it. It's super, super pretty, and the music in this one is absolutely phenomenal as well. The first boss of this dungeon is probably the one that stands out the most to me, even though it's nothing crazy, right? The main mechanic here is that he'll drop some poison on the floor and then he'll do like left-right cleaves basically, but rather than actually just cleaving the left or the right, they do these like poison puddle drops instead. But I mean, effectively the way you dodge the mechanic is exactly the same. You still dodge left, right, depending on which side he's cleaving. So honestly, it's nothing crazy. I just think it's an interesting visual tell, and you know, he can mix you up, hit the same side twice, shit like that. It's a cool mechanic, and I do like the way this boss looks. I think he looks pretty damn cool. He also has this little memory game mechanic where you'll have to remember which side of the arena he's cleaving in which order, and then dodge accordingly, but it's very, very easy memory game. It's super simple shit. Skipping ahead some more because there's basically nothing to talk about with the ads in this dungeon. The actual visuals here are really damn nice. I love this kind of like soul conveyor belt where you see the souls going down and there's like these white rooms with really nice like lighting and shit. I absolutely love the way this dungeon looks, I will say. Skipping ahead to our second boss, I find this one kind of forgettable, and honestly this is kind of my main thing with this dungeon and why it ranks the lowest out of all the other ones, is because it just doesn't feel memorable in the same way that the other 6 after this do. You know, every dungeon after this has a part of it that I find to be extremely memorable, whereas this specific dungeon, like I like the aesthetic, I like the music and whatnot, but there's not like a boss or a mechanic or anything like that where I'm like, oh yeah, it's the dungeon with that thing in it that I really liked. It's mostly just like another dungeon in Dawntrail, you know what I mean? Skipping over the second boss because I basically have nothing I want to say about it. There is actually an ad pack here that I do want to talk about, or at least one specific ad, this big fucking mecha turtle, because this dude is an absolute unit. He's a fucking tank, and his ad takes forever to kill. But on top of that, he spams his goddamn hard stomp move, which I think you can stun him the first couple times he does it, but eventually he becomes stun immune, and you just have to either get out or just stand in it like I do. Like, I'm a melee DPS player, I'm not getting out of the AoE, bro. I'm not losing uptime. You know, the white mage is probably fucking bored anyway. You get what I'm saying? Like, give them something to do, stand in the AoE, why not? A very strange ad room, though, seriously. I don't really know what they were going for with this one. It feels like they could have maybe given this turtle some more to it, or like a few more mechanics going on to make it feel less like just like random. I don't know, dude. This room feels so fucking random to me. Like you just have this giant turtle in it that does one attack that basically forces you to leave melee range, and that's all it ever does, and it has this giant health pool that takes like nearly as long as a boss to kill. I don't really know how to feel about this. Honestly, it's more interesting, to be fair, right? It's more interesting than your average pack of ads where you're just spamming AoE and doing nothing, but at the same time, it's like only marginally more interesting, like a tiny bit. So, not really gonna give this one any extra points, but it is there. And it's something that, it's the most memorable part of this dungeon to me, ironically, because I'm like, what the fuck is this? Why is this here? Moving on to our final dungeon boss. Again, I just don't really have a whole lot to say here. It doesn't stand out very much. You know, there's a few little nice dodges like that knockback you just saw there, but like, this boss really doesn't stand out to me. Nothing about it is like, oh yeah, the final boss from Origenics. I remember that one. Like, not really. You get what I'm saying? So, I don't know. I'm just gonna kind of leave it at that. That's our number 7 spot. Not a whole lot to say about it. Coming in at the number 6 spot on my list, we've got our level 93 dungeon, Warcore Zormor. Now, honestly, big bonus points to this dungeon for being such a step up from the level 91 dungeon that came before it. I would say in terms of many things, right? In terms of visuals, in terms of pacing, and in terms of boss design, this dungeon just stands out significantly more than the dungeon that came before it. Again, I'm mostly going to be grazing over the ad packs because this is another dungeon where they don't really do anything with the ad packs. There's nothing to talk about. It's not like ads are doing AoE damage. It's not like there's heal checks. You know, we'll get to that when we get to the best dungeons in the expansion, but this one the ads don't do anything, and that's kind of the case for the entire dungeon. The first boss is overall pretty nice though. You got like this goofy looking snow guy. I like his design. He looks goofy. He looks cute. So basically this guy's whole thing is that he's going to make the whole arena look unsafe, but then he'll actually freeze some of the AoEs he's going to set off and then make them go off delayed, make them go off later. So you just need to dodge into the frozen ones and then into the ones that go off first. Very, very simple stuff. You know, we've seen variations of this before and other things. You know, I think of the clocks on the floor in the Stormblood Alliance raids where like you got to stand on the slow clock, move into the fast clock after it goes off. You know, pretty standard stuff for 14. We've seen stuff like it, but it has unique visual tells, and it has this kind of overwhelming feel to it, I think, especially if you're like a casual player, where like, holy shit, the whole arena's unsafe, like, where do I go? So I kind of appreciate that it does that. Specifically this time he does it later in the fight, he literally just throws shit all over the arena. It's like, oh my god, where the hell do I stand? You know what I'm saying? So I do appreciate how like visually cluttered this fight honestly is. I think that's kind of a cool way to do it. And again, this dungeon just makes great use of the graphical upgrade. Like, this place looks gorgeous, and I love how each part of the dungeon has its own kind of specific feel to it. Now, in terms of this second boss, I actually really, really like this one. I think it has some super cool visual tells, has some fun and satisfying little dodges and spreads and donut markers and all of that kind of stuff. I'm really positive opinion on this boss. I really like this one. He'll leave these crystals on the floor, basically, and in this case, it's a spread. You don't want to stand inside of it, and we also need to spread. But then, you know, afterwards, now it becomes a safe spot. He's doing this wind thing, so we need to stand in that circle of crystals. Plus, we have donut markers on us, so we all got to stack up together. He'll take it a step further too and put these like lines on the floor with the crystals instead, and this creates for much tighter safe spots, right? As you can see here, we stacked the donuts, so it wasn't a big deal, but if you don't stack the donuts and everyone spreads out, it can be quite a bit harder to make room for everyone. And the spread version of this mechanic here leaves for very, very small amounts of room for people to move in. So I thought that's a really, really interesting mechanic, and it just has a nice visual tell. It looks quite unique. Again, nothing particularly mind-blowing where it's completely changing or innovating the game, but really nice dungeon boss. Just a solid-feeling dungeon boss. It kind of goes beyond what we're usually used to in terms of pacing, in terms of safe spots. Just feels really good to fight. Skipping towards the last boss, though, I think this guy's the real star of the show when it comes to this dungeon for a few reasons, but mainly because he gives us a damage up phase where we get to run around collecting orbs and getting damage up buffs, which I think is awesome. Any scenario in Final Fantasy XIV where we can, as the player, get damage up stacks is so, so cool to me. More shit like that in dungeons, please. You know, we really don't see it very often. In terms of actual mechanics, this guy is pretty simple. The orange thing he puts down will do kind of this Titan type, like expanding outwards AoE, kind of like E4S if you've done that, a much simpler version, obviously. The blue one is just a regular knockback, it's nothing too stand out at all. But yeah, this little damage up phase here where the boss tries to absorb a bunch of these orbs to get stronger, this is one of my favorite parts of this fight. I remember on day one when I did this dungeon, none of us were soaking the orbs because we thought we had to like avoid them or something, and then the boss got like a million stacks of damage up. So yeah, it's pretty cool mechanic. I like how it flips it on you. It's not about dodging it, it's about collecting as many as you can to give yourself a big damage buff. So, really cool little mechanic. I hope they do more with that, with letting players get like a big damage up buff during a boss fight. I think that's really cool. I will say though, the rest of this fight, in terms of just regular mechanics, doesn't stand out a whole lot. It's nothing crazy, but I definitely don't mind it. I don't think it's a bad boss, and it stands out way more to me than anything in Origenics in terms of boss designs, especially because of that damage up phase, but just in general. So overall, very positive impressions on this dungeon, and if I happen to get this in my leveling roulette, I would be very satisfied with this, because, oh my god, dude, these Dawntrail dungeons are just on a whole other level compared to the rest of the game, in my opinion. Anyways, let's get on to our number 5 spot. Starting off the top 5 of our dungeons in Dawntrail, we have Alexandria. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this area is a Final Fantasy IX reference, but I've never played that game, so I don't have any kind of bias or nostalgia towards this dungeon. I don't really know anything about Alexandria outside of the context of Final Fantasy XIV, so do keep that in mind. I will also say, of the 3 Expert Roulette dungeons this expansion, this is the one I have gotten by far the most for whatever reason, so there may be a little bit of bias there with, like, you know, I'm starting to get a little bit sick of this one compared to the other 2, but, you know, again, it's still a very phenomenal dungeon, and we're going to talk about that. On the run-up to the first boss, it does one of those kind of single ad things like the turtle I was talking about in Origenics from earlier, but this one is far less annoying. It doesn't have some massive fucking health pool you have to take down. It dies relatively quickly, it looks pretty cool, you know, and it doesn't spam an out AoE that you constantly have to lose melee uptime for if you don't want to get hit. I do kind of like this idea here, though, of having mini-bosses in dungeons, kind of reminiscent of what Aglaia had between pulls, where instead of doing a bunch of ad packs, they did, like, mini-bosses that had their own mechanics. So my hope for the future is that they do, you know, instead of ad packs all the time, they incorporate these little mini-bosses that actually have, you know, some degree of mechanics that the whole party has to dodge. I think that would be really neat. As for the first boss itself, though, I'm actually a really big fan of this one. It does a pretty cool, like, little memory check mechanic, but the pacing of it is really quick, and it makes for a super satisfying dodge every time you do it, even if it is a very easy mechanic. You know, usually when it comes to a normal mode dungeon like this, you expect the boss to just be twiddling their thumbs the whole time, not actually fucking doing anything, you know, and you wait 10 years per AoE to go off. But the pacing of this, like, memory game is actually relatively quick, where if you, like, stop and stand still for a second, you are actually going to get hit, so you have to pay attention. Again, it's not some, like, uber fast, like, oh my god, extreme trial pacing all of a sudden, but it makes the dungeon feel a little bit more exciting than your average dungeon, if you get what I mean. Unfortunately, the boss doesn't do a whole lot other than this mechanic, but I think the mechanic is strong enough on its own for a normal mode that it creates for a fun fight, and I look forward to repeating it every time I get this dungeon. Overall, this second boss probably stands out the least to me of the 3 in this dungeon, but that's not because it's bad by any means. It's a very solid dungeon boss, and again, I think it shows the player a lot of respect by not making every mechanic as simple as, like, don't stand in the fucking orange in the floor. They actually expect you to use your eyeballs, pay attention to what the enemies and the bosses are doing, and not get hit by these mechanics, and I really appreciate that. I think that's a level of respect that they should be showing for players at this point. We are level 100 now, and I think the dungeons need to reflect that a little bit. The final boss in this dungeon in particular really illustrates this well for me. I mean, look, I just ate shit on it because I wasn't paying attention to what the boss was doing. But what I appreciate here, again, there's no, like, orange AoEs telling you on the floor, don't stand here. They show up right as the mechanic is going off because they expect the player to be looking at what the boss is doing for tells. And it's not just like, oh, look at the boss for tells, because they've done that before in normal mode content. It's the pace at which it happens. It's not at a snail's pace. It's not going super fucking slow so everyone and their grandma has time to react. it's actually coming out relatively quickly, and you actually need to use your eyeballs and pay attention. It's putting the expert into expert dungeons, and I appreciate that so fucking much. I think the major strength of these expert dungeons in general, and we'll talk about the other two when we get there, is they actually make you feel like you are at level cap. You are reaching endgame content now. These aren't just leveling dungeons, these aren't progression dungeons. These are the dungeons you need to farm over and over again to get your endgame gear, to get into other endgame things such as Extreme. This is a much more organic and natural rise in difficulty than jumping from something like Smileton in the previous expansion to all of a sudden doing Hydaelyn Extreme. It's so hard to bridge that gap as a casual player when you've never done any sort of difficult content. I feel like these dungeons in particular are actually helping to bridge that gap, even if it's just a little bit. Again, these dungeons aren't fucking uber hard or something. It's not like you're doing Criterion Savage dungeons. It's just that they're actually forcing you to use your eyes, look at the boss, read cast bars, do things that are going to be mainstay staples in any sort of extreme or savage fight. Overall, Alexandria is an absolutely phenomenal dungeon, and it sets the bar in a completely new realm for the future of expert dungeons, in my opinion. I pray that they continue on this path of continuing to make expert content actually have expert in it. But enough about Alexandria, let's head onwards to our number 4 spot. Coming in at my number 4 spot, we have none other than Vanguard. I mean, seriously, what's there not to like about Vanguard? This is an incredible dungeon. It's a turning point in the story where things start to get a lot more interesting. The enemy designs start to get a lot more unique and fresh. Just the whole aesthetic of this dungeon in general is very, very good. The gear from this dungeon is absolutely beautiful. Some of my favorite glamour we've gotten in this expansion. The background music in this dungeon is phenomenal, up there on the levels of stuff like the twinning to me. Hell, even this first ads pull keeps things interesting. Like, these enemies do a fucking huge line AoE with this really, really tiny safe spot you gotta squeeze into. I love that. Kind of reminds me of the Puppet's Bunker, the near raid near the end, where you have to keep dodging between different line AoEs and shit while you break barriers. I love that part of that raid. And these ads here actually do interesting things that the party has to dodge, not just the tank midding. I would absolutely love for if in the future with dungeons they do more ad pulls like this, where the ads have a couple mechanics going on that makes them a little bit more threatening, a little more stuff you have to pay attention to rather than just like watching Netflix and doing AoE. The first boss is solid too. He's got this nice kind of mindfuck mechanic that's a little bit hard to read because you have to pay attention to where his sword is going to end up, and then that part of the arena is the part that's going to become unsafe. I remember the first couple times I ran this dungeon, I was so confused how you're supposed to read that mechanic, but once it clicks, very, very simple dodge. Overall, I will say this is probably the weakest of the 3 bosses in this dungeon, but it's still solid regardless, and I have no qualms about fighting it. It just doesn't quite stand out as much as the other 2, specifically the next one we're going to talk about. Skipping over to the second boss, I absolutely love this dungeon boss. It is so cool. It's so chaotic for a dungeon boss. It's not at all like what I would have expected to see in a normal mode dungeon. Like, none of these dodges are particularly hard, right? But these are actually super fast AoEs that you have to dodge for like your average dungeon boss. I think this is one of the coolest normal mode dungeon fights they've ever had the balls to add, because genuinely you actually have to be on your shit and paying attention in this fight. And I think that's really, really cool. There's also this acceleration bomb phase like midway through the fight where you've got to do some line AoE dodges and then stop in time for your acceleration bomb to resolve. Really cool stuff with that. Glad to see more like read your debuff mechanics in normal mode. I think that's a really good thing. And then the second time he does AoE Chaos is awesome because it also has those electric walls up you can see, where if you walk into one of those, you're going to get a paralysis, so you don't want to do that, but you also have to keep dodging this onslaught of AoEs that the boss is spamming at you. Such a satisfying little mechanic. I absolutely adore this boss, and it might be my favorite dungeon boss to come out of the entirety of this expansion. Super good stuff right here. Unfortunately, the final boss doesn't come anywhere close to this level of quality, in my opinion. Not anywhere near a bad dungeon fight or anything like that. It's just coming off of such a good mid-boss, like, this final boss doesn't really compare to it. I think this was more so a fight used to show what the little, like, soul enhancements would do So like we got to see this guy transform into his snake form and then get like some extra mechanics with that. But overall, none of the mechanics in this fight are terribly interesting in my opinion. I do kind of fuck with this synth slither mechanic because it's really fun to just gap close as soon as he does it and not worry about getting hit. For some reason, you can just kind of keep uptime during this. It's not really risky at all to just gap close to him and keep hitting him. So it's pretty satisfying as like a melee, specifically Viper when you have 3 charges of gap close because you can keep doing it over and over again. But like otherwise, it's just a super easy mechanic to dodge, so it doesn't really feel all that satisfying otherwise. I imagine if you're like a ranged DPS, it's really not that interesting. And hey, I do appreciate that in this part of the fight here, you do actually have to read the guy's cast bar to dodge his mechanics. You know, you don't see that every day in dungeons, so I am very happy whenever the game actually makes you pay attention. I think that is a net positive. Overall, I'm a pretty big fan of Vanguard, and I had absolutely no problems farming the hell out of this dungeon to get a bunch of the glam that I wanted, because honestly, it's just a really fun dungeon to farm, and again, that's just not something I felt towards any dungeons in any previous expansions, where I was like, yeah dude, I'm gonna queue up for this and farm it, that's what I want to do. Overall, a fantastic dungeon, and the fact that it is only number 4 on this list just goes to show how good the next 3 are. So without further ado, let's move on to our number 3 spot. Coming in at the number 3 spot on our list and the final leveling dungeon of this list, we've got none other than the level 95 dungeon, the Skydeep Cenote. There's just so much that this dungeon gets right for me. I love the aesthetic. I love the way that it gradually changes as you progress through it towards the big reveal at the end. The music in this dungeon is some of my favorite in the entire game. It's just so memorable to me. I love the track that plays in this one. And the boss fights here are fantastic too. Namely, the final boss in this dungeon is one of my favorite dungeon bosses they added this expansion. And I feel like I've been saying that a lot already. The first boss gave us this classic meme of the text coming up on your screen that says you are cursed to be a nuisance to your party, which is just a really funny way of telling you you're gonna have a Protean shoot out of you basically, or in this case Bubbles. But yeah, the core idea of this boss is that he'll show you a mechanic, and then he'll make you a nuisance to your party, and then the mechanic will start coming out of your character, basically. So first he does Proteans, and then he does these bubbles, and overall, it's a pretty creative idea, honestly, especially for a midway leveling dungeon, where, you know, it's not like the expert dungeons, which we're going to talk about next, which kind of, like, actually do push the boundaries of what we're used to. Like, I feel like for a leveling dungeon, this is a very solid boss, and it's pretty creative, too, so I'm a big fan of this one. Again, really not much to talk about in regards to ad packs in this dungeon, unfortunately, but in terms of actual visuals as you progress for the dungeon, this has one of my favorite progressions as you go through it, where, you know, you start off in this upper part that looks pretty, like, familiar and not too crazy, and then you start to descend into these ruins where things are starting to look pretty interesting before you finally reach the final part of the dungeon with the big reveal. The second boss has a pretty cool mechanic where he'll put these like orbs around the arena, and then he'll put a mirror on one side of the arena where he's shooting at, and it's going to reflect his beam off of that and hit the orb as you're seeing, and then that orb does a massive explosion on that side of the arena. So it creates for an interesting kind of read you have to do to figure out where the safe spot is. Nothing too crazy, but again, better than your typical don't stand in orange that we're used to in dungeons. It's really this final section of the dungeon that elevates it to third place for me, though. Like, look at this view, man, as you approach the Golden City for the first time. And dude, this was such a nice little curveball in the expansion where things finally started to look very different. It was like this alien kind of looking area. It just looks so damn cool to me. I love the color schemes, I love the visuals. Again, they make great use of the graphical update in these dungeons, which I think is a really, really good thing. Even these regular ad pulls have some super cool looking enemies, like these stonemason guys with the big axes. These dudes look so cool. The real star of this show, though, is Titan Maximum himself, man, and I'm not even joking. This is basically E4S Lite as a dungeon boss, and I am all for it. You know, the first time I fought this boss and the first time I did this dungeon, he killed me right away with that first knockback attack he does, and it was just love at first sight at that point. I was like, if a boss is killing me with knockback, that's my type of boss. The visuals on some of these dudes' attacks are just so cool, too. I love that kind of, like, I don't know how to describe it, that, like, robotic, alien-looking square type thing. Almost has, like, a Nier vibe to it, if you know what I mean. It just looks so damn cool. To me, this is the pinnacle of what a leveling dungeon should be. Something that blows you away in terms of cinematic, in terms of spectacle, but something that also has bosses that are no slouch and are fun to repeat even when you're spamming them to level, right? Because that's the big thing with these leveling dungeons is even though you might not be spamming them as much as the expert ones because that's its own roulette, you're still going to end up using these to level certain jobs, and so you are going to end up doing the dungeon a lot. Particularly, I like this part with the knockback here, where he charges both hands, and then you have to dodge onto the side that isn't going to get cleaved, and then, into the other side. Really nice dodge for a normal mode, and beyond what I would expect for just a level 95 leveling dungeon. All in all, I could just go on about this dungeon forever. I fucking love it. I think this is the best leveling dungeon they've ever done, ever. I love the way it progresses as you, reach the Golden City and shit. Such a good dungeon, and probably the most memorable dungeon of this expansion to me, just in terms of, visual and spectacle. If the Skydeep Senna was the king of spectacle this expansion, it's these two next dungeons that are the absolute kings of gameplay this time around. Coming in at our number 2 spot, we have the Strayboro Deadwalk. Now this one may be a bit of a contentious ranking because I know a lot of people absolutely despise this dungeon and specifically one boss in it, but to me, this dungeon has grown on me so much since its initial release. At first, I hated the first boss just like everyone else, and now it has become one of my favorite dungeon bosses ever because it's absolutely hilarious watching people get hit and not being able to do anything for 10 seconds. I love this dungeon. I love the carnival fun little aesthetic it has going on. I love the ghost shit it has going on. This dungeon is so awesome, dude. This first boss is an absolute menace, let me tell you. If you get hit by any of these little guys running into the arena at any point in time, like you're gonna see me do here, yup, that's it. You're bound in place, and as soon as that shit lands on you, you can't act for 10 seconds, bitch. You just gotta stand there. At first, right, this was so frustrating to me, and I think many other people felt the same way. But over time, replaying this fight, it is so fun trying not to get hit by these guys and trying to keep as much uptime as possible while doing it. I have grown to absolutely adore this first boss, and I honestly think what balances out too to not make it too annoying is this boss really doesn't feel like he has a lot of HP. So even if you guys are getting hit by the mechanics a lot, it still doesn't feel like the fight drags on forever or anything like that. He honestly dies very quickly. This fight certainly gets the award for boss that has grown on me the most this entire expansion. What sets this dungeon apart from the others, though, is that it keeps this pace up the entire time. The second boss does this really unique, almost Mario Party type mechanic where you gotta track these teacups with your eyes and figure out which ones are gonna explode with AoEs. So in this case, we want to dodge opposite of the teacup. And, I still got hit there because the game hates me, but you get the point. You need to actually track the shit with your eyes, all while maintaining your rotation on the boss, which creates for actually a really fun little mechanic despite how simple it is. It also just feels incredibly fresh. I don't think there's anything else in the game like this, especially with the speed that these teacups start to move in the second part here, and how confusing it can be on your eyes. Holy shit, man. It's so cool. I don't think they've done anything like this before. But hey, it doesn't end there either. You know what else this dungeon has? It has ads that actually fucking do something. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. We got ads that actually are slamming the fucking ground, doing raid-wide damage to everyone. So now, instead of your healer just occasionally dropping some heals on the tank, they actually get to try to keep the whole party up, mitigate the damage. Reprisal is actually more valuable here, shit like that. I absolutely love these little doll ads and how much they add to the ad, killing experience. I hope in the future they continue to do kind of mini boss ads like this that have almost mechanics the party has to pay attention to. Really cool stuff. And that's not even all, man, because this final boss is the absolute peak of this dungeon to me and one of the coolest normal mode dungeon bosses we have ever seen in the game. The core idea behind this fight is that you need to switch between being a human and being a ghost, because being a ghost is going to let you pass through certain walls and live through certain mechanics. So here, right, we need to stretch a tether away from that ghost there, so we need to turn ourselves into a ghost so we can walk through walls. You gotta be careful though, because the boss has a big AoE called Ghost Duster, which is gonna fucking kill you if you're a ghost. He also has a big AoE called Flesh Buster, which is going to kill you if you're not a ghost. So there's a lot of like back and forth during this fight of making sure you're in the right mode so you don't get killed by mechanics. And I really appreciate that the price of failure is actually just death in this fight. They want you to pay attention. They want you to do the mechanics correctly. And I think that's perfectly reasonable because the mechanics are very simple and straightforward and anyone can learn them. Overall, if I had to crown one boss this expansion for being the best dungeon boss that they've done, it's this guy. This guy is the best dungeon boss that we have seen this expansion, and potentially that we've seen ever. I am seriously so optimistic to see what we get in 7.1 and onwards for the patch dungeons, because if they keep up this feeling of actually feeling expert, we're going to have some really goddamn memorable dungeons this time around. But without further ado, let's get on to our number 1 spot. Topping off our list at the number 1 spot, we've got none other than Katana Ravel in the Source, aka Tender Valley. It was a real toss-up for me between this one and Strayboro, on which I prefer to do more, but ultimately I just kind of prefer the aesthetic, the music, and the overall design of the bosses in this one just a little bit over Strayboro, even if I think Ghost Hades is the greatest fucking dungeon boss we've ever seen. Also, I'm just a big fan of these little cactuar dudes. I think they look hilarious, and so, you know, there's some bias in there. I'm just a fan of this dungeon. I mean, obviously there's some fucking bias. This is my list, bitch. I fucking love this first boss, dude, because he's this huge ripped cactus man, but on top of that, he's a troll. I don't think there's a boss in this game that's a bigger troll than this guy the first time you fight him. This dude will start doing a mechanic, it'll look like the safe spot's obvious, and then all of a sudden the safe spot gets way smaller. Now, if you've done the dungeon multiple times, you already know his kind of tricks, and you know what he's gonna do. But god, the first time I did this dungeon, I was like, what the hell is this guy doing? Specifically towards the middle of the fight where he does prickly right or prickly left, and you're like, oh, it's just a left-right. And then the shit closes in completely, and only a very small slice of the arena stays safe. I love that little mix-up, and I think this guy is hilarious. I also like how he stacks these exploding cactuses together with this like closing in safe spot move, but gives you just enough time to dodge it and then move into the safe spot. The second boss is also just absolutely fantastic, forcing you to pay attention to both halves of the arena because he can launch bombs into the square side or into the circle side, which is going to change the dodges you're doing. Again, nothing too crazy, but it's just a nice normal mode boss that'll keep you on your toes while you're fighting it instead of making you fall asleep. I also appreciate how he'll combine kind of his core mechanic with spread markers at one point later in the fight, so not only do you need to find room to dodge, but you also want to be ready to spread immediately after the mechanic resolves, so I thought that was a really cool way to kind of add on to it. I don't think it can be understated how much better the pacing feels in these dungeon bosses than anything that came before them. I don't feel like I'm falling asleep. I don't feel like there's a million hours of downtime between mechanics where the boss is just sitting there doing nothing. It feels like I've actually got to pay attention to what's happening, and it creates for such a good dungeon experience compared to what we're used to. And bosses aside, this dungeon does something that I really appreciate in a dungeon, and that's making an ad pack something that isn't just a mindless ad pack. You actually need to use these platforms to block certain, AoEs from hitting you. It's literally the Katana Ravel, right? They've done this before, but this is literally them saying, yo, we can do it again, and this is me saying, yeah, you should. You should keep doing this. It makes ad pulls so much more interesting, and it also gives the tank more to do than just sit there and mitt an AoE. They actually get to pull the ads into certain places so their party can keep hitting them while remaining in the safe spot. So this type of ad room in particular is such a fantastic idea. I would love to see them innovate upon this idea in the future. The last boss in this dungeon is also very solid, even though I don't think it's quite as good as something like Ghost Hades that we just talked about. It still does enough to keep it unique and fresh and make it stand out among dungeon bosses, specifically with its maze mechanic. This boss will basically create a maze and put a timer on you, and the goal is to find the way into the maze. And as you can see here, I was too slow, and so I actually died. And, that's shit that I love to see in dungeons, right? It's not just like, oh, you failed the mechanics, so you get one vuln up and life goes on. No, you failed the mechanics, so you die, and now your healer has to do something. I think that's great. I think that's fantastic, and in a dungeon that is labeled as expert, I think that should be the standard. All in all, Dawntrail has had some of the greatest dungeons that Final Fantasy XIV has ever seen, in my opinion, and I never would have seen myself being so into these dungeons that I'd be willing to sit here and rank them all in a 40+ minute long video. Say what you will about Dawntrail's story and its job changes and all of the other questionable decisions they've made, at the very least, the combat content we've gotten this expansion is so much fun. But yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for my ranking of all of Dawntrail's dungeons that obviously came out on release alongside of it. In 7.5, like a million years down the line, I will probably end up ranking all of the patch dungeons, especially if they continue with this level of quality, which I pray that they do. But yeah, that's pretty much going to do it for my ranking of all of Dawntrail's dungeons. I am a huge fan of the dungeons this time around, as I've said a zillion times throughout this video, so feel free to leave your own dungeon ranking in the comments. I'd be very curious to see other opinions on this stuff because, while dungeons are content that literally everybody does who plays this game, I feel like we don't see a lot of discussion surrounding them, outside of the beginning of the expansion, people complaining that expert roulette is too hard or whatever. Besides that, like actual sentient human beings, I'd love to hear their opinions on this, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, jokes aside, remember to drop a like on the video, but only if you did, and subscribe to the BigBluePurple channel if you're not already. I make near-weekly Final Fantasy XIV content. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.